Leave, no, human. We're eternally bound now, you can't go anywhere. Emma sat at her small wooden desk, the soft hum of her laptop filling the otherwise quiet apartment. Rain tapped gently against the window, forming tiny rivers that slid down the glass, twisting and merging as they went. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, staring at the blinking cursor on her screen. Tonight, like many nights before, she had promised herself she would finish her article early and get some sleep. But somehow, hours had passed, and the words refused to flow. The apartment was small, a cozy one-bedroom tucked into a quiet street on the edge of the city. It wasn't the newest place, but Emma liked it. The floors creaked just enough to remind her of the building's age, and the faint smell of old wood mingled with her own scent of coffee and late-night snacks. She had moved in 6 months ago, seeking solitude and space to work, yet lately the quiet felt heavier. More than quiet, it felt watched. She shook her head and laughed softly at herself. "It's just the rain," she murmured, but the feeling wouldn't leave. Emma had felt it before, sometimes while she was cooking, sometimes while reading in the living room, but it always passed when she told herself it was nothing. Tonight, however, it lingered, and a shiver ran down her spine. The first sign was subtle. A mug, one she had left on the edge of the counter, had moved a few inches. She had been sure she had placed it further to the left. Emma frowned, walking over and setting it back in the right spot. Then she noticed the chair in the corner of the room had shifted slightly, angled toward the desk in a way it hadn't been earlier. Emma tried to breathe slowly, grounding herself. She reminded herself that she lived alone, and small things like this happened all the time. A breeze from the cracked window, a slight shift in the floor, perhaps even her own forgetfulness. She returned to her desk and rubbed her temples. The words on the screen stared back at her, mocking her inability to write. Then came the whisper. At first, she wasn't sure. It was soft, almost lost beneath the sound of rain, but it grew, threading through the hum of the laptop and the patter of water on the windows. "Leave. No, human, we're eternally bound now. You can't go anywhere." Emma froze. Her hand hovered over the keyboard, fingers trembling. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. The room seemed to pulse with tension, as though waiting for her to respond. Silence followed, but it was heavy, almost expectant. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "It's just my imagination," she said aloud, louder this time. "I'm tired, that's all." But even as she said it, her heart thudded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that wouldn't slow. Her mind raced. Maybe it was stress, maybe the long hours she had been spending alone. Emma had always been careful, organized, and rational. She didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. And yet, the feeling was real. It wrapped around her like a shadow, cold and insistent. Emma tried to focus on the screen, typing a sentence, then deleting it. Her thoughts wandered. She remembered the old tenant who had lived in this apartment before her, a man named Mr. Harris. He had passed away in the apartment, neighbors said, quietly and alone. A part of her had wondered about him when she first moved in, imagining his life in the same rooms, walking the same creaky floors. She had laughed at herself for thinking about it too much. But now the thought came back with a weight she couldn't shake. What if something had lingered here, something that didn't want to let go? She shivered, drawing her cardigan closer around her. The lights flickered, just once, and then the glow of the lamp returned. Emma held her breath, eyes darting around the room. Every shadow seemed sharper, darker, moving in ways it shouldn't. Her rational mind fought to explain it. Faulty wiring, maybe, or fatigue making her imagination run wild, but the chill creeping up her arms said otherwise. Emma stood up, pacing slowly. "I need to calm down," she murmured. She walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The rain had slowed, but the streets outside were empty and gray. She could see reflections of herself and the dim interior lights, but nothing else. No figure, no movement, just her own anxious gaze staring back. Then she heard it again, closer this time. The whisper, but now not just words, breathing, soft and deliberate, brushing against her ears, though no one was there. She turned in a slow circle, heart racing, but the apartment was empty. Her rational side, the part of her that clung to logic, was screaming that it was impossible, yet every hair on her arm stood on end. Emma tried to speak again, voice firmer this time. "I don't know what you want, but you can't scare me." She paused, listening. Nothing. For a few precious seconds, silence returned. Then a single, sharp knock came from the corner of the room where the chair had shifted earlier. Her heart nearly stopped. She forced herself to step closer, hands trembling. Nothing was there, yet the air felt dense, heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Emma's mind raced. She thought about leaving, running down the stairs, calling someone. But the whisper came again, soft and relentless. "You can't go anywhere. We are bound eternally." Tears pricked at her eyes, not from fear alone, but from exhaustion, confusion, and a strange sense of being trapped. She sank onto the floor, back against the desk, hugging her knees. The apartment, her once safe sanctuary, felt like it was closing in. Every shadow was a watcher, every sound a threat, yet she could find no explanation. Emma thought about her life, her quiet mornings with coffee, the afternoons spent typing stories, the evenings reading by the window. All of it seemed fragile now, as though a single thread could snap it apart. And perhaps, she realized, that thread had already snapped. Hours passed. The rain continued to fall, the whisper fading into an almost constant background hum, a reminder that she was not alone. She stared at the laptop screen, unable to write, unable to move. Exhaustion finally claimed her, and she drifted into a restless, uneasy sleep, dreams filled with shadowed corners and soft, commanding voices. When she awoke, the apartment was still. Sunlight peeked through the clouds, casting warm patterns across the floor. For a moment, Emma felt relief. Perhaps it had all been a nightmare, she thought. But the shifted chair, the slightly moved mug, and the lingering chill reminded her that something had changed. Something was watching, and somehow, invisibly, it was waiting. Emma rose from the floor, determined to act normal. She brewed a fresh cup of coffee, opened the window to let in fresh air, and tried to convince herself that she was safe. And for a little while she was. Yet deep in her chest, she carried the heavy certainty that her life would never feel the same again. Something unseen had anchored itself to her, and whatever it was patient, silent, and eternal. Since that unsettling morning, Emma had been trying to convince herself that nothing was wrong. The sun streamed through her apartment window, warm and golden, and the small kitchen smelled of fresh coffee. She sat at the table, sipping slowly, attempting to shake the lingering unease from the previous night. Yet every time she glanced at the slightly tilted chair or the mug on the counter, her stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. She couldn't explain it, and that made her anxious. Emma went about her day cautiously. She tried to distract herself with work, emails, writing, editing, but her focus kept slipping. Every few minutes she caught herself staring at the corners of her apartment, where shadows seemed just a little too sharp, a little too dark. She even tried to play music, something upbeat, hoping the sound would chase away the oppressive feeling. Yet no matter what she did, she couldn't ignore the sense that someone, or something, was there, quietly observing her. It began with small, almost unnoticeable changes. Objects she had left in certain places were no longer where she remembered them. A pen she had left on her desk would be on the couch. A notebook she was sure she had placed on the shelf appeared on the floor. At first, she told herself she was misplacing things. Maybe she had been more distracted than usual, she thought, but deep down she knew it wasn't that simple. One evening, while making dinner, Emma felt a cold draft brush against her neck. She froze, gripping the edge of the counter. The window was closed, and the air outside was warm, damp from the lingering rain. She turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Just the dimly lit kitchen, the smell of onions and garlic, and the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. "Okay, it's nothing," she whispered to herself. Her voice sounded strange in the emptiness, too loud, echoing. She returned to cooking, trying to ignore the chill crawling up her spine. But that night, as she was chopping vegetables, she heard it again, the soft whisper. Not words this time, just a sigh, close to her ear, barely audible yet undeniable. Emma dropped the knife with a clatter. Her heart raced, and she backed away from the counter, looking frantically around the kitchen. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound brave. The apartment remained still, silent except for the occasional drip of water from the sink. No one answered, no one moved, and yet she could feel the weight of something watching her, pressing against the edges of her mind. After that night, Emma's sleep became restless. She would wake in the middle of the night to shadows stretching across her walls, to sounds that shouldn't have been there. A soft tap on the window, the creak of the floorboards in the hallway, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. She tried keeping lights on, tried reading, tried making herself busy, but the presence never left. It lingered, patient, invisible, unrelenting. Emma began documenting everything. At first, it was just notes. Mug moved, 8:32 a.m., chair angled differently. 2:15 p.m., soft sigh in kitchen, 7:48 p.m. But soon she started writing longer entries, how she felt, how her mind raced, the fear and confusion that gripped her. Writing became her way to keep control, to convince herself that there was a logical explanation. Yet even as she wrote, she knew deep down that something extraordinary and unwelcome was happening. One afternoon, Emma decided to leave the apartment briefly, to walk in the nearby park. Fresh air, movement, and daylight might help her think clearly. She grabbed her coat and keys, stepping out into the crisp air. For a short while, she felt relief, the world outside feeling solid and real. She walked among trees, listening to the wind rustling the leaves, and even smiled when children played nearby. But when she returned, the apartment was different, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that made her chest tighten. The coffee mug on the counter was facing a different direction. A chair that had been tucked neatly under the table was pulled out slightly. And most chillingly, there was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "You can't go anywhere." Emma froze, her keys slipping from her hand. She stepped back, looking around, heart pounding. She didn't understand how it could know she had left. She hadn't spoken aloud, hadn't left any sign that she would be away. The thought alone was terrifying. This presence wasn't just in the apartment. It somehow knew her movements, her routines, her life. In the days that followed, the incidents became more intense. At night, her bedroom door would creak open slightly, even though she was certain she had closed it. She would wake to her blankets being tugged, not violently, but enough to feel a pressure as if someone, or something, was lying close beside her. Emma's mind struggled to make sense of it. She wanted to call someone, tell a friend, or even seek help, but she feared what people might think. Who would believe her? How could she explain a presence that left no trace but an overwhelming sense of being watched? She tried everything to regain normalcy. She rearranged furniture, cleaned obsessively, lit candles, played music, and even left small offerings of flowers and water in corners of the apartment, hoping it might calm whatever was there. None of it helped. In fact, sometimes the apartment seemed angrier after these gestures, as if the presence didn't appreciate interference. One evening, Emma was on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, attempting to read a book, when she noticed the shadows moving unnaturally. They didn't follow the patterns of light. They twisted and stretched as if alive, slinking across walls and ceiling. She held her breath, staring at them, mesmerized and horrified. Then, without warning, the whisper came again. "You can't leave. We are bound eternally." Emma felt tears well in her eyes, the weight of isolation pressing down on her. She had always valued independence, solitude, and quiet reflection. Now, even in the sanctuary of her own home, she felt trapped. Sleep came less and less, replaced by hours of tense awareness, every sound amplified, every shadow suspicious. Her work suffered. She missed deadlines. Her friends called less frequently, sensing her distraction. Emma's world was shrinking, limited to the apartment and the unending presence she could not escape. Desperation began to creep in. She questioned her sanity. She considered moving, breaking the bond by leaving the apartment entirely. But deep in her chest, she knew the presence wouldn't let her go. Every attempt to imagine packing, driving away, or starting over was met with a mental wall, as though the apartment itself, and whatever lived within, resisted her escape. Emma started leaving small notes around the apartment, speaking directly to the presence. "I don't understand you. I'm not your enemy. Please leave me be." Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she found the notes crumpled or moved to different places. Sometimes they were untouched, but always the whisper returned, soft and commanding. "We are eternally bound. You cannot leave." It was during one particularly long night that Emma noticed a pattern. The presence reacted strongly when she expressed fear, sadness, or resistance. Calm acknowledgement seemed to lessen its intensity. It was as if it were testing her, measuring her emotions, learning her weaknesses. This realization terrified her further. She was no longer just sharing space with a mysterious entity. She was being observed, studied, even manipulated. Her days became a careful balance. She tried to maintain routines, forcing herself to eat, write, and occasionally speak to friends on the phone. She refused to let the presence control her entirely, yet she knew she had to respect its limits. It wasn't malevolent in a traditional sense. It did not harm her physically, but the psychological pressure was immense. Every movement, every sound, every heartbeat reminded her of the invisible observer. And still, Emma could not leave. Every plan to move or escape dissolved under an invisible force. The presence waited patiently, eternal and unyielding, while she lived under its gaze. Slowly, she began to understand that whatever bound her and the entity together, it was not about control alone. It was about connection, about a tie that could not be broken, a shared history she had yet to uncover. By the end of that long week, Emma realized that her life had changed forever. She had once considered her apartment a safe haven, a quiet retreat. Now it was a place of tension, learning, and awareness. The presence was always there, silent yet insistent, a shadow that could never be dismissed. And though fear coursed through her daily, a small part of her began to wonder, what did it want? And why was it bound to her as much as she was bound to it? Emma had no answers, but she knew one thing. She could not pretend it wasn't there, nor could she escape. The apartment, the presence, the whisper, all were now threads woven into the fabric of her life. And somehow, whether she liked it or not, she had to learn to live with it. Emma had reached a point where fear no longer fully described what she felt. It was deeper than fear. It was a weight pressing on her chest, a constant reminder that her life was no longer entirely her own. She had tried ignoring the presence, documenting it, reasoning with it, but nothing worked. Every day it seemed to grow more aware, more patient, more intent on remaining close to her, and Emma knew she had to confront it. That night she prepared herself as best as she could. She turned off all the lights, leaving only a single lamp on the desk. She lit a small candle, its gentle flicker casting warm shadows across the walls. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her hands resting on her knees, and closed her eyes. Deep breaths. In, out, in, out. She had read about meditation techniques that might help her center herself, and now she needed every ounce of calm she could muster. "All right," she whispered into the room, her voice steady but low. "I know you're here. I know you've been following me. I want to understand you. I want to know why you are here." For a long moment, nothing happened. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears, and she imagined every shadow in the room moving toward her. Then she heard it. Not a whisper this time, but a voice, soft yet clear, filling the apartment like a quiet wind. "You cannot leave," it said. "We are bound eternally." Emma's eyes snapped open. She forced herself to stay calm, forcing words past her shaking lips. "I don't understand why, tell me. Why are we bound?" The voice seemed to sigh, a sound like distant wind or the shifting of old wood. "You do not remember," it said almost mournfully. "But you were there, the fire. You did not know what you were doing. You left me behind." Emma's heart caught in her throat. The fire, she remembered it suddenly, vivid flashes of smoke, heat, chaos. Months ago, she had been in the building for a story about old apartments and tenants. The fire had started unexpectedly in one of the lower apartments, and she had rushed out, saving herself, unaware of someone trapped inside. She had not known who had been left behind. Her stomach churned as she realized the entity she felt was somehow tied to that life. I didn't know," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "I didn't mean I did," her voice broke. "Intent does not matter," the voice said, gentler now but still firm. "You cannot leave because we are connected through that moment. You hold a part of me in your life, and I am bound to you." Emma felt the weight of the words, the invisible chains tightening around her thoughts. But alongside fear, a strange clarity began to form. She understood now, the presence was not malevolent. It was trapped, tied to her through circumstance, through fate, and just as she was bound, so was it. "I don't want to be your prisoner," she said firmly, wiping her tears. "And I don't want you to be mine. Can we talk? Can we understand each other?" There was a long pause. Then slowly the shadows in the room shifted, twisting toward her, but not aggressively. The air grew colder, but not painfully so. The voice returned, softer, almost reluctant. "You cannot undo what happened, but you may acknowledge it, you may honor it. Then we may find balance." Emma understood. She had to face the past, admit what had happened, and show that she remembered that she cared. She sat quietly, closed her eyes, and spoke aloud, recounting the events of that night, the smoke, the flames, the confusion. She admitted her fear, her guilt, and her sorrow. She apologized, not because the entity demanded it, but because she needed to express it herself. As she spoke, she felt something shift. The oppressive weight she had carried for weeks seemed to lift slightly. The shadows receded and the room felt less hostile. The voice, when it spoke again, was gentler still. "You remember, you acknowledge, this is enough for now." Emma opened her eyes. The room looked the same, yet different. Not brighter, not warmer, but calmer. She felt the presence less as a threat and more as a quiet companion. A companion she could never fully see, never fully understand, but one she could coexist with. Determined to solidify this fragile peace, Emma continued speaking, recounting small details from her life and inviting the presence to witness them. She described her mornings, her writing, the songs she loved. She asked the presence to communicate if it wanted her to know something. Sometimes she would feel a brush of cold air or a soft vibration in the floor, subtle signs that the entity was listening, present, aware. Over the next few nights, Emma kept this ritual. She did not sleep much, but she did not feel trapped either. She began to notice that when she remained calm and respectful, the apartment was quieter. Objects stayed where she left them. The whispers came only as reminders, not as threats. She realized that confrontation alone was not enough. Understanding and acknowledgement were necessary. One evening, she tried speaking directly to the entity in a new way. "We are bound," she said, voice steady. "But that does not mean fear must rule us. We can coexist. I will honor what happened, and I will live my life fully. Will you let me?" For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then a single chair creaked, moving slightly toward her, almost like a nod of agreement. The room felt lighter, almost as if a fog had lifted. Emma allowed herself a small smile, the first in weeks. This new understanding did not make the presence vanish. It did not leave her apartment. It remained, a constant reminder of that night, of life, of responsibility, but it was no longer a force of oppression. It was quiet, patient, and watchful, not to harm, but to exist alongside her. Emma realized she had reached the climax of her struggle. She had confronted the unknown, faced her guilt, and forged a tenuous peace. In the following days, Emma continued to live her life with cautious optimism. She returned to her work, more focused than she had been in weeks, though always aware of the quiet presence in the apartment. She even ventured outside for walks and brief outings, feeling confident that she could face the world and return safely. The entity did not prevent her from leaving. It only reminded her of the bond, of the connection that could not be broken but could be respected. Emma began to see her apartment not just as a home, but as a space of learning. She had grown more mindful, more observant, and more patient. She noticed small details she had ignored before, the pattern of sunlight across the floor, the sound of rain tapping against the window, the subtle shift of shadows at night. Everything became meaningful, connected, and alive in a way she had never understood before. One night, as she sat writing, she felt the presence near but calm. The shadows shifted in the corners of her vision, but there was no fear this time. She spoke softly, describing her day, her thoughts, and her gratitude for the lessons she had learned. The whisper came faintly, a gentle reminder. "We are bound eternally." Emma nodded, accepting it. "Yes," she said, a quiet smile on her lips. "We are bound, but we are not enemies. We can exist together." For the first time, she slept fully through the night, the presence remaining, but not in a way that demanded her attention. She had reached the turning point, the climax of her struggle. Fear no longer ruled her life. Understanding had taken its place. She had faced the unknown and discovered a way to live with it, to coexist, and to find strength in the bond rather than weakness. Emma's journey was far from over. The entity would remain, patient and eternal, just as the voice had promised. But she had learned the most important lesson. Some connections cannot be broken, but they can be understood, respected, and integrated into life. She was no longer a prisoner of fear, but a witness to the invisible, a participant in a story that stretched beyond the ordinary. And in that understanding, she found freedom. After the long nights of fear and confrontation, Emma began to notice subtle changes in herself. She no longer felt the heavy weight pressing down on her chest each time she entered her apartment. The whispers were still there, soft and persistent, reminding her of the bond she could not break, but they no longer caused panic. Instead, they felt like a presence she had to acknowledge and respect, a silent, invisible companion that she was learning to live with. The first real sign of progress came one quiet morning when she awoke without the familiar tension squeezing her stomach. Sunlight poured through her window, painting golden stripes across the floorboards. For a moment, she simply lay in bed, listening to the soft rhythm of the city outside and the occasional distant chirp of birds. No whispers, no shifting shadows, just calm. It felt like a breath of fresh air after weeks of suffocating uncertainty. Emma decided it was time to test her new understanding. She moved carefully around the apartment, touching familiar objects, rearranging them gently, and speaking softly as she did so. "I see you," she whispered, acknowledging the presence. "I understand you are here." I respect you. The air felt different, still charged but lighter. She could feel a subtle awareness, almost like the entity was listening attentively, not judging, not demanding. Over the next few days, Emma began to engage in daily routines with deliberate mindfulness. She cooked meals with care, noting the way steam rose from the pots and the aroma of spices filled the kitchen. She cleaned, not obsessively, but thoughtfully, enjoying the process as if each action mattered to more than just herself. She read, wrote, and organized her workspace, feeling the presence nearby yet not intrusive. Every movement and sound she made seemed to be acknowledged silently, as if the apartment itself had gained a life of its own. She also began to speak to the presence more openly. She shared details of her life, her struggles at work, small joys in her writing, memories from childhood, even fleeting thoughts about friendships and future plans. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, she felt a brush of cold air, a gentle vibration through the floor, or a subtle flicker of shadows, a response that told her the entity was listening. Slowly, these signs became a form of communication, a quiet companionship that replaced fear with curiosity and understanding. One afternoon, Emma sat at her desk writing a story about her experiences over the past months. As she typed, she paused to reflect on how much she had grown. She had once been overwhelmed by fear, guilt, and uncertainty, but she had learned to face those emotions head-on. The presence, once terrifying and suffocating, had become a teacher in its own way, guiding her to observe, acknowledge, and coexist. Despite this progress, Emma knew the bond was still unbreakable. She could not leave the apartment, nor could she erase the connection to the entity. Accepting this was difficult at first. She had always valued freedom and independence, and now she was tied, in a sense, to something she could not fully see or understand. Yet she realized that acceptance did not mean surrender. It meant understanding the rules of coexistence and living within them. Emma also noticed changes in her sleep. She could rest longer and more deeply, waking refreshed instead of startled. The whispers no longer woke her in the middle of the night with terror. Instead, they were reminders, gentle and distant, that the bond remained. She began keeping a journal again, but now she wrote not only about fear and confusion, but also about small moments of peace, about observations of the world around her, and about the strange companionship that had grown in the apartment. A turning point came when she decided to invite a friend over. She had been isolated for weeks, afraid of sharing her experiences for fear of being misunderstood or judged. Yet, she felt it was time to reconnect with the world outside her apartment. She chose a close friend, someone who had always been supportive and who she trusted. She explained that her apartment had become a place of unusual experiences and that she had been learning to cope and coexist with them. Her friend arrived hesitantly, sensing the tension in the space, but also noticing the calm that now seemed to pervade it. Together, they walked through the apartment, talking softly. Emma demonstrated how she had adapted her routines, how she acknowledged the presence, and how it no longer felt threatening. Her friend listened, nodded, and offered encouragement, reminding her that learning to coexist with something beyond her understanding was not weakness, but strength. With this renewed human connection, Emma began to feel more grounded. She still spoke to the presence, still acknowledged the bond, but she also allowed herself to live more fully. She ventured out for longer walks, wrote more consistently, and even reconnected with old friends she had distanced herself from during the months of fear. Each return to her apartment was no longer a test of courage, but a continuation of the understanding she had established with the presence. The presence itself seemed to change subtly with Emma's growth. Where once it had been cold, demanding, and insistent, it now felt quieter, almost patient. Objects no longer moved without reason. Whispers were gentle reminders rather than commands. Emma realized that the entity had learned to coexist with her, just as she had learned to coexist with it. Their bond, once terrifying, had become a stable, if unusual, part of life. One evening, Emma sat on the couch with her journal, the city lights twinkling through the window. She reflected on her journey over the past months, the fear that had gripped her, the restless nights, the whispers, and the shadows. She remembered the fire, the life she had unintentionally affected, and the moment she had confronted the presence. It had been a turning point, a confrontation that had demanded courage, honesty, and acceptance. Writing in her journal, she acknowledged the presence formally for the first time. "We are bound," she wrote, carefully choosing each word. But we can coexist. I honor your existence and I live my life fully. We are part of each other now and I accept it. She placed the journal aside and looked around the apartment. It felt alive, familiar, and safe in a way she had never imagined. Days turned into weeks and life continued with a delicate balance. Emma maintained her routines, acknowledged the presence, and allowed herself to live without fear. She had learned to embrace the reality of the bond, not as a curse, but as a unique connection that had taught her patience, mindfulness, and respect for the unknown. The apartment was no longer a place of terror. It was a space of understanding and coexistence. Emma also began exploring ways to honor the life that had been lost in the fire. She placed a small photo frame on a shelf in the living room, lighting a candle near it each evening. She spoke softly to the presence, sharing memories, regrets, and gratitude. It became a ritual, a way of keeping memory alive while acknowledging the bond that tied her to that moment in the past. This practice brought a sense of closure. The presence no longer seemed like a shadowed companion of fear, but a silent witness to her growth and understanding. Emma realized that acknowledgement, respect, and acceptance were more powerful than fear or denial. She had learned that some bonds could not be broken, but they could be transformed into something that fostered awareness, empathy, and personal growth. Even the nights, once the most difficult part of her days, became manageable. Emma could sleep, knowing that the whispers were no longer threats but reminders, and that the shadows were observers, not aggressors. She had reclaimed her life within the apartment, finding peace in coexistence. Her fear had been replaced with understanding, her panic with mindfulness, and her isolation with cautious companionship. Emma reflected on her journey often. She realized that the bond she shared with the presence had changed her profoundly. She was more observant, more patient, more aware of the world around her. She had learned to face fear, confront the unknown, and accept the things she could not control. Her apartment, once a source of terror, had become a space of growth, understanding, and reflection. In these months, Emma discovered that life could continue even in the presence of something extraordinary. She understood that she could never fully see or comprehend the entity, but that did not diminish her ability to live fully. She had learned to coexist with the unknown, finding strength, calm, and wisdom along the way. By the end of Part 4, Emma had reached a delicate balance. She had faced the climax of her fear, confronted the presence, and emerged with understanding and acceptance. The bond remained unbreakable, but it no longer dominated her life. Instead, it became a quiet part of her reality, a reminder of responsibility, awareness, and the extraordinary lessons hidden in everyday life. Emma had learned that some connections, no matter how unusual or invisible, could teach patience, empathy, and respect. She had learned that fear could be transformed into understanding, and isolation into companionship. Most importantly, she had discovered that life, even when bound to something unknown, could still be lived fully and richly.